This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition. Axis and Allies, the Anniversary Edition, was originally released in 2008 to celebrate Avalon Hill's 50th anniversary. The game was published by Avalon Hill, a division of Hasbro, and designed once again by Larry Harris Jr. Axis and Allies, the Anniversary Edition, takes about 6 hours to play. The Anniversary Edition was a celebration of not only Avalon Hill's 50th anniversary, but the culmination of all things Axis and Allies. At the time of its release, this was the biggest Axis and Allies game ever made. The board is 2 feet by nearly 4 feet wide. This edition would later be dwarfed by the 1940 Global Edition. That board is 5 feet 10 inches wide. However, even today, this is still an impressive board to look at when it's all set up in front of you. Besides this, the Anniversary Edition is chock full of content, from alternate setups for 1941 or 1942, 2 tables of technological breakthroughs to discover, additional gameplay pieces like the cruiser and Chinese infantry units. Anniversary even added a 6th player with the addition of Italy as the 3rd Axis power. The original 2008 edition was a premium price game released in limited quantities, and once it sold out, it became an expensive collector's item. Then, just this last holiday season, Avalon Hill re-released Axis and Allies, the Anniversary Edition. This time in greater quantities and at a much more affordable price. So now there's no excuse not to pick up a copy. So if you're thinking about getting this game or already have a copy, stick around because we're going to learn how to play Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition. So without further ado, let's take a look at setting up the game. This is the game board for Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition. At its heart, Axis and Allies is a classic area control game. The game board's map is sectioned into land and sea territory spaces. Players begin a game with a set of territories modeled on a national power during World War II. There are several territories on this guide color-coded light gray. These represent areas that are impassable for political or geographic reasons and are often referred to as neutral territories. These neutral territories cannot be attacked, moved into, or passed over. Keep these territories in mind as you plan strategies throughout the game. Axis and Allies Anniversary offers 2 setup configurations listed on the back of each player's national setup chart. A 1941 setup scenario and a 1942 setup scenario. Both scenarios emulate the positions of these greater national powers at that stage of World War II. Following the setup guide, each player will place air, land, and sea units in the specified territories and sea zones. When placing units, it may be necessary to use chips in either cramped spaces or if you run low on figures. Chips are placed beneath the figure and represent additional figures of the same type. A gray chip represents 1 additional figure. A red chip represents 5 additional figures. Once all units have been placed, let's turn our attention to other aspects of the game board. Many land territories have an industrial value anywhere from 1 up to 12 points. Once per turn, a player's collective industrial points will yield an equitable amount of currency called Industrial Production Certificates, or IPC. Players use this currency to purchase military units to protect their current territories and allow them to conquer territories from other players. Each territory expansion increases a nation's total industrial power and allows them to purchase more military units to defend and further expand their holdings. To win the game, players on either the Axis or Allied sides must capture and hold 15 of the total 18 victory cities. The current total industrial power for each nation is tracked on the national production chart. This chart is placed alongside the game board for all players to see. The control markers are updated every time a player takes and loses a territory. At the beginning of the game, each player receives IPCs equal to their ranking on the national production chart. The following is the IPC allotment for the 1941 setup. Italy receives 10 IPCs. Japan receives 17 IPCs. The Soviet Union receives 30 IPCs. Germany receives 31 IPCs. The United States receives 40 IPCs. And the United Kingdom receives 43 IPCs. To facilitate this process, one player can assume the role of a banker and manage the distribution of IPCs to players throughout the game. Depending on the setup, players will take their turns in a set order of play. In the 1941 scenario, the first player is Germany, the second player the Soviet Union, the third Japan, the fourth the United Kingdom, the fifth Italy, and the sixth the United States. The US player's role is unique in that they control both America and China. Many of China's actions are conducted separately from the main US actions. We'll cover off on the specific etiquette for playing China later in the tutorial. Each player will also receive a set of Victory City tokens that they control at the beginning of the game. These tokens will be exchanged amongst players as cities are lost and gained during the conflict. Remember, once either the Axis players or the Ally players claim 15 Victory City tokens, that side wins the game. Finally, off to the side of the game board, place the battle board and the red and black six-sided dice. These components are used to determine the course of battles and whether players gain or lose territories. At this point, the game is set up and we're ready to begin learning how to play. Next, we're going to take a look at the phases of gameplay. Each national power will play through 7 game phases that comprise a player's turn. In this example, the game is set up for the 1941 scenario, and the first player is Germany. Germany's turn begins with research and development. This is an optional phase of the game where players invest in scientists who every turn have a chance to attempt to make a technological breakthrough that allows the player to upgrade their units. If your playgroup does not want to deal with this level of complexity, then Germany's turn would then begin with Phase 2, Purchase Units. In this phase, Germany pays IPCs and places orders for new units. However, these units will not become available until Phase 6, Mobilize New Units. Then in Phase 3, Germany makes its combat moves and deploys units into enemy-held territory. In Phase 4, all territory conflicts from the combat moves phase are resolved. Following this, all non-combat moves are conducted, typically to secure territories. Next, in Phase 6, Germany may place the units purchased in Phase 1 in territories with industrial complexes. And in the final phase, Germany collects income from all new and recently captured territories. And that's the general flow of a player turn sequence. Now, let's look at each of these phases in greater detail. Let's begin again by looking at the research and development phase. Research and development can be completed in up to 4 steps. In the first step, players purchase researcher tokens for 5 IPCs each. Players can purchase as many researcher tokens as they can afford. Each researcher token gives the player a 5-sided die that can be rolled during this phase to attempt to make a scientific breakthrough. In Step 2, the player rolls the 6-sided die for each researcher. If the roll is 5 or less, the researchers fail to make a scientific breakthrough. The player then keeps all of his tokens and tries again on his or her next turn. However, if the die roll is a 6, a scientific breakthrough is made. The player then discards all their researcher tokens. So keep that in mind when you're buying them. There's a bit of a gambling mechanic involved. A player can also only achieve one scientific breakthrough per turn. The player will then proceed to step 3, rolling the breakthrough dice and see what they've discovered. The breakthrough charts can be found on the left side of the national production chart. The player can then decide which breakthrough chart he or she wants to roll a die on to see which scientific breakthrough they made. If the player chooses breakthrough chart 1 and rolls a dice, if they roll a 1, they discover advanced artillery. With advanced artillery, one artillery unit can now support 2 infantry units, which raises the infantry's attack to 2. If a 2 is rolled, rockets are discovered. Rockets allow AA guns to conduct industrial strikes on industrial complexes up to 3 territory spaces away. This can cause 1 to 6 points of economic damage, and reduces the production capacity of that industrial complex by that many points. If a 3 is rolled, then the paratrooper ability is enabled. The paratrooper ability allows a bomber to carry and deploy 1 infantry unit. However, the bomber must deliver its paratroopers when it enters the first hostile space. A roll of 4 increases factory production. Increased factory production allows an industrial complex to produce 2 additional units per turn. A roll of 5 enables war bonds. With war bonds, a player can roll a 6-sided dice per turn and receive that many IPCs. With a roll of 6, mechanized infantry is activated. Mechanized infantry allows an infantry unit to accompany a tank and move 2 spaces. Now let's look at the discoveries on Breakthrough Chart 2. On a roll of 1, super submarines are discovered. The super submarine discovery increases a submarine's attack to 3. On a roll of 2, jet fighters are discovered. With jet fighter technology, fighters now attack on a 4. On a roll of 3, improved shipyards are put into place. Improved shipyards create an efficiency price cut on all naval units. On a roll of 4, radar is discovered. Radar increases an anti-aircraft gun's defense to 2. On a roll of 5, long-range aircraft are unlocked. With long-range aircraft technology, bombers now have a range of 8 and fighters a range of 6. And finally, on a roll of 6, heavy bombers are discovered. Heavy bombers can conduct strategic bombing raids with 2 dice. When a new breakthrough is discovered, players place one of their control markers on the technology space on the breakthrough chart. Other players can discover the same technology, but technologies cannot be shared amongst players. Next is Phase 2, where the player gets to purchase new units. Each player's national setup chart lists the cost and key statistics for each unit. Keep this chart handy as you're making decisions regarding your forces throughout the game. During this phase, players spend IPCs to purchase units to be deployed later in the turn. This graph shows each unit's expense in land, air, and sea categories. Each unit can cost from 3 IPCs all the way up to 20 IPCs each, so choose carefully. Players can purchase as many units as they can afford, but be aware. An industrial complex is required to produce the units, and those units can only be placed in the industrial complex's location. The only exception to this rule is when purchasing additional industrial complexes. These can be constructed and placed in whichever territory the player owns. Once a player has selected units and paid the bank, the units are placed in the mobilization zone until phase 6 of that player's turn. This prevents new units that technically aren't in play yet from getting confused with active units on the board. Another logistical rule to be aware of is that an industrial complex can only produce as many units per turn as the value of the territory it's located in. For example, an industrial complex in Japan can only produce 8 units per turn. Keep this in mind as you purchase new units and be sure you have a place to put them. On the topic of industrial complexes and production capabilities, later in the game, industrial complexes may suffer damage from strategic bombing raids. A strategic bombing raid reduces an industrial complex's unit output. During this phase, players can spend IPCs to repair their damaged industrial complexes at a cost of 1 IPC per point of damage. In Phase 3, a player conducts combat moves to position his units within striking range of enemy positions. While there are several units in Axis and Allies, movement capabilities amongst them are fairly straightforward. In the land unit class, infantry, artillery, and anti-aircraft guns can move 1 territory space per turn, and tanks can move 2 territory spaces per turn. In the air unit class, fighters can move 4 territory spaces and bombers can move 6 territory spaces. In the naval unit class, all units can move 2 sea zones per turn. Now this is a pretty straightforward comparison. Next, we're going to look at the specific transit rules for each group. Let's begin by talking about the transit rules for each zone, starting with land units. Transit rules can be divided into 2 groups: permitted moves and prohibited moves. Starting with permitted land movements, obviously the first is the combat move. In a combat move, land units enter a hostile territory, and this triggers combat in the next phase. Players can also conduct a capture move. With this maneuver, a player moves his forces into an undefended territory and takes it over. Similar to the capture move, tanks can conduct a blitz maneuver. When conducting a blitz, tanks move into an undefended territory, capture it, and then blitz to an adjacent territory. The territory can be hostile or friendly. A tank can even turn around and blitz back into the territory it started from. Now let's look at some prohibited moves for land units. Anti-aircraft guns have a limited move. They can only move during the non-combat moves phase. And as far as neutral territories, all units are prohibited from entering neutral territories. Sea transit rules are slightly more complicated because sea zones can be divided into surface and submerged areas. First, let's look at the permitted moves for sea transit. Once again, naval units entering a hostile sea zone constitutes a combat move that may be resolved in the next phase. However, if the sea zone only contains submarines and transports, then the player moving in can choose to ignore conflict and proceed to the next sea zone. Submarines can submerge themselves and enter or pass through hostile sea zones. However, if a submarine enters a sea zone with a destroyer, they must stop and cannot move any farther. While we're talking about sea units, let's cover off on the transport. Transports cannot fight and are primarily used to transport land units. A transport has room for an infantry unit and either a secondary infantry unit or one of the following: a tank, an AA gun, or an artillery unit. Some additional rules regarding transports. In naval combat, they are always the last unit removed. Transports can be used cooperatively amongst players on the same side. For example, during the US turn, that player can use the transport's cargo space to move Soviet land units or British land units. Transports can also participate in coordinated naval landings called amphibious assaults. We'll cover off on amphibious assaults in the combat phase. Finally, let's look at the air transit rules. Air units are unique in that they can travel over land or sea zones. However, air units must plan their movements from the combat move phase to the non-combat move phase. This is to ensure that the plane can land in friendly territory. The etiquette for this is to announce a sort of flight plan. A player must declare an existing friendly destination for his planes to land prior to launching the trip. A player cannot declare a destination that is currently hostile and hope the upcoming combat phase will make it friendly. Like land and sea units, air units can proceed into hostile territory as a combat move, and the conflict will be resolved in the next phase. Be aware that aircraft making a combat move is subject to anti-aircraft fire. In my own games, I house rule this to include flyovers as well, but the actual rules state otherwise. And like for the other divisions, while air units have a great deal of flexibility, they cannot fly over neutral territories. It's Phase 4, let's talk about conducting combat. In combat, each unit has a rating, whether they participate as an attacker or as a defender. When that unit participates in combat and rolls a 6-sided die, they score a hit if they roll their attack or defense rating, or less than that number. In this chart, each unit is represented with the attack rating on the left in red and the defense rating on the right in black. As you can see, some units perform better as defenders rather than attackers, and vice versa. Transport units cannot attack or defend, and the AA gun can only defend. You can also see across all units that a roll of a 5 or a 6, whether attacking or defending, is always a miss. Keep these attack and defense ratings in mind as you form your own strategies and as we walk through the combat tutorial. Once you've made all the combat moves, then it's time to resolve each conflict. Each battle is conducted in combat rounds of 6 steps each. For our example, we're going to look at a naval battle. In the first step, each player places their units on the battle board, matching their unit type to the silhouettes. On the attacking side, the American forces are comprised of a battleship, a submarine, and a transport with 2 infantry units on board. The Japanese defenders are comprised of an aircraft carrier with 2 fighters and a battleship. In Step 2A, anti-aircraft guns fire at aircraft. This step is not applicable to our example at sea, but on land it would only happen at the beginning of the battle. An anti-aircraft gun can target up to 3 aircraft with 1 die each. On a roll of a 1, the aircraft is destroyed. This will be further illustrated in the upcoming strategic bombing raid example. Step 2B is centered around submarine involvement. Submarines have a choice. They can participate in the battle and utilize their surprise strike ability, or they can choose to submerge and slip away from the battle in a retreat at the end of the combat round. The US player decides to have his submarine conduct a surprise strike on the enemy. The center of the battle board provides a reminder of which dice rolls each unit needs to make to score a hit. The US player needs a 2 or less to score a hit with their submarine, so they roll the die. The US player rolls a 1 and scores a hit. Therefore, the defender suffers 1 hit and must choose one of its units as a casualty. The defender has a battleship which can suffer 2 hits before being eliminated. Therefore, the defender decides to use his battleship to absorb this strike. To keep track of the damage inflicted, the defending player flips his battleship on its side. Normally, whenever the defender suffers a hit, their unit is slid back to the casualty zone. The casualty zone is only on the defender's side. This zone keeps track of casualties that still have one last chance to fight back before they're removed from the game. Now that we're out of the pre-combat phases, we get to the heart of the battle. In Step 3, attacking units get to fire. A die roll is made for each unit, and if that result is their attack rating or less, then they score a hit on the defender. The submarine has already conducted its attack with its surprise strike, so the only remaining unit to attack is the battleship. The battleship needs a roll of 4 or less to score a hit. The battleship rolls a 4 and scores a hit. The defender chooses one of its fighters as a casualty and moves it back to the casualty zone. In Step 4, now it's the defender's turn to fire back. First, the defender rolls a die for the aircraft carrier. The aircraft carrier rolls a 2, which is a hit. The U.S. attacker decides to absorb this hit with his battleship and flips it on its side. Next, the defender rolls a die for his damaged battleship. The battleship rolls a 3, which is another hit. The attacker sacrifices his submarine because he can't sacrifice his transport and he doesn't want to lose his battleship. The submarine is removed immediately and does not have a casualty zone because it's already rolled its dice for this combat round. Next, the defender rolls his dice for his fighter and his fighter in the casualty zone. The fighters roll a 5 and a 6, both misses. Now that the defender is rolled for all his units, it's time to proceed to Step 5, remove defender's casualties. And it's now time to say goodbye to the fighter in the casualty zone. And finally, we're at Step 6. In this step, the attacker has a choice. They can press the attack and continue through another round of combat, or they can initiate a retreat and remove their units from the defender's territory. The U.S. player decides it's time to retreat before they lose the battleship and the transport with the 2 infantry units. Next, we're going to look at 2 special modes of combat, the strategic bombing raid and the amphibious assault. A strategic bombing raid is considered an economic attack and, if successful, reduces the amount of units that industrial complexes can produce. A strategic bombing raid is conducted in 3 steps. In the first step, bombers within range proceed to the targeted industrial complex and must survive anti-aircraft gunfire. Each anti-aircraft gun can roll 1 die per bomber. A roll of 1 is considered a hit and the targeted aircraft is destroyed. In Step 2, if the bombers survive anti-aircraft gunfire, then the actual bombing commences. Each bomber can roll 1 die. That die result indicates the number of damage markers placed beneath the industrial complex. Each damage marker reduces the industrial complex's production output of new units by 1. An industrial complex cannot receive more damage markers than twice the amount of the IPC value of the territory it is located in. Step 3 takes place during the non-combat phase, and it's simply moving the surviving bombers back to friendly territory. If you'd like a little more complexity to your strategic bombing raids, there is an official variant that allows fighter escort. This version of the strategic bombing raid is a 4-step process as opposed to the regular 3. The key difference to this variant is that now a player can send fighters to escort their bombers on a strategic bombing raid. Just remember, any fighters that participate, this counts as their combat move. This becomes useful because if an AA gun scores a hit, the defender can now select a fighter as a casualty rather than the bomber. The biggest difference to this version is that in the new Phase 2, if the defender's territory has fighters, they can take off to engage attacking fighters and bombers. What then follows is a mini combat phase. In this mini phase, combat plays out like a normal battle, but for only 1 round. The exceptions to the combat rules are that when dogfighting, attacking fighters hit on a 1 or less, and defending fighters hit on a 2 or less. And bombers cannot fight at all. Once the single round of combat is complete, the strategic bombing raid continues as normal for steps 3 and 4. Keep this variant in mind if you want a more realistic version of the strategic bombing raid. Next, let's talk about the coordinated action known as the amphibious assault. The amphibious assault may take up to 3 stages of combat to complete. The first stage is the sea battle. The second stage is offshore bombardment, but this only occurs if there was no sea battle. And third and finally is the landing and the assault. Sea battles occur when there is a hostile sea zone with enemy ships and planes. During this stage, transports cannot attack during the battle, but they can be chosen last as casualties. If the attacker has air units involved, they must make a choice. The attacker's air units can participate in the sea battle phase or the landing and assault phase. They cannot fight in both. If a sea battle doesn't occur, any battleships or cruisers involved can conduct an offshore bombardment. This is a one-time attack against units on the targeted territory. Finally, in the third stage, transports land on the beaches and unload their cargo. At this point, a traditional land battle begins. The land units can then get support from any air units that did not participate in a sea battle. Now that all the battles are resolved, it's time to perform non-combat moves. Non-combat moves are primarily used to reinforce territories and involve moving units from one friendly territory or sea zone to another. Also unique to this phase is that the anti-aircraft gun can now be moved as well. All combat moves should have been completed previously and are now considered prohibited during this phase. Now it's time to mobilize the units purchased back in Phase 2. In this phase, purchased units are moved from the mobilization zone to a nation's eligible industrial complex. The number of mobilized units produced are limited to the industrial power of the territory that the industrial complex resides in. In this example, I've listed all the nation's industrial complexes available at the beginning of the game. Remember, any new industrial complexes purchased can be placed in any territory that nation owns. However, the industrial output of the new complex is governed by the industrial rating of that territory. Finally, in Phase 7, it's time to collect income. During the various battles, players should have been updating the position of their control markers with the gain and loss of territories. Now it's time for the current player to collect his or her industrial production certificates. The banker counts out his bills and the turn is nearly over. However, there is just one last thing. Axis and Allies Anniversary provides players with an opportunity to earn bonus IPCs with national objectives. National objectives are themed to a nation's beliefs during World War II. A nation's national objective can be found in the upper left-hand corner of the national setup chart. For example, Germany's national objective is Lebensraum, or living space. When a player successfully role-plays and fulfills a nation's ambitions, they receive bonus IPCs. Germany will receive 5 bonus IPCs for controlling specific sets of territories. I'll leave the remaining national objectives for you to discover during gameplay. Now let's discuss other rules that will come up during gameplay. Inevitably, during the course of a game, a nation's capital is going to be occupied by the enemy. After a successful invasion of the capital, the occupier collects all of that nation's IPCs. The original owner is still in the game, but they cannot collect income or buy new units. Any remaining units in unconquered regions can still fight on as a sort of resistance. If that conquered nation's capital territory is liberated, either by that nation's resistance forces or the nation's allies, then that player regains control of their forces and plays again as normal. Now finally, as promised, let's talk about China. The rules for handling China can be a bit convoluted. The US player controls China, but is played as an independent nation. When playing as China, the US player must conduct China's available gameplay phases separate from their own. Either China goes first and completes their game phases, or America goes and completes theirs. To make this a bit clearer, Chinese units are restricted to territories indicated with the Chinese emblem. The only other territory that Chinese forces can occupy is Kwangtung if the Axis take it over. And if they do, that territory is considered liberated for the United Kingdom. So basically, all of the China turn is restricted to these territories I've bordered in white. Another nuance to gameplay is that at this period in history, China is not an industrialized nation. Therefore, Chinese territories do not generate IPCs for the Allied powers, only the Axis powers. Reading between the historical lines, if the Japanese invade and take over China, they use the people badly to generate IPCs. The kinds of things they don't print in Japanese high school textbooks on World War II history. However, while China is free, every turn she generates one infantry unit for every 2 territories controlled. These units can be placed in any Chinese-controlled territory that does not exceed 3 units. China can use these infantry forces to hold territories they already own, or liberate Manchuria and Jiangsu. China also has 1 American fighter at her disposal. This unit represents the Flying Tigers. And once this unit is gone, it cannot be replaced, even if the Duke is involved. The China rules are interesting in that they add a micro game to the already larger conflict at stake around the rest of the world. Once the US player finishes his or her turn and collects their income, it's time to check the total number of victory cities the Axis and Allied powers control to see if there is a winner. The default game length mode is called Surrender with Honor and requires that either the Axis or Allies control 15 of the 18 victory cities. For a shorter game, players can opt for Projection, which only requires 13 victory cities. And for those die-hard fight-to-the-last-man types, Total War requires all 18 victory cities to be controlled. In any case, whichever game mode you choose, you should have enough information now for your game group to embark on your own experience with Axis and Allies Anniversary. And that wraps up our coverage for Axis and Allies Anniversary Edition. Questions about this game, requests for future Harsh Rules game tutorials, and constructive feedback are all greatly appreciated. Drop a line in the comments section. To be the first notified when this episode and any Harsh Rules episode is placed online, please subscribe to this channel. As always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.